Hello everyone, welcome to today's talk on transnational education mobility, class, race, and nationalist ideologies. I'm Shanshan Jiang, a PhD candidate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In today's presentation, I will talk about my current research on transnational education mobility between China and the US, specifically on how class, race, and nationality intersect to shape international students' college experiences. Student migration, as one of the most significant mobilities in the 21st century, has been considered an essential component of transnational migration. In 2000 and 2001, over 500,000 international students entered the US for education, and the number jumped to over 1 million in the academic year of 2018 and 2019. According to NASA, international students contributed an estimated $41 billion in the year 2019. Among the international students in the US, 70% are from newly industrialized countries in Asia and Latin America. In particular, Chinese students accounted for more than 1/3 of the total foreign student population in the US. Unlike previous students who relied on multi-generational kinship networks to secure jobs and housing, contemporary international students were mostly middle and upper middle class who actively used their socioeconomic capital to pave pathways to better educational opportunities, housing, and global social networks. This project was developed on a transnational framework. Transnationalism offers a critical lens to understand the movement, resistance, and negotiation within co-constitutive spaces. It allows researchers to focus on the agency of transnational individuals, the ways they respond to different geographic and cultural contexts, and the strategies they use to navigate those contexts. Transnational methodology offers an opportunity to reveal macro-level global processes through specific meso-level flows between local places and communities. Existing literature on transnational Chinese communities in North America can be found in history, anthropology, and geography. One of the most cited works on Chinese transnationals in North America is 𝗖адц Flexible Citizenship, where An illuminates transnational mobility as a natural reaction among elite classes in East Asia to respond fluidly and opportunistically to changing political economic conditions. An articulates the process of neoliberal subject making among transnational families. For transnationals who possess abundant economic and social capital, Western education is often seen as a means to achieve upward mobility through a flexible developed country citizenship that ultimately leads them to greater wealth, freedom, mobility, and prestige. While previous scholars provide insightful perspectives on Chinese transnational students in the US, recent political economic changes in both countries, such as President Xi Jinping's abolishment of his term limit, the increasingly centralized power within the Chinese Communist Party, the thriving of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the escalation of the US-China trade war, and the severe budget cuts in the US public education have been added new layers of transnational desires and nationalist sentiments among Chinese students. In this project, I specifically examined two questions. First, how Chinese students overseas educational experiences are largely structured by the People's Republic of China for human capital accumulation and the political goal of national rejuvenation. Second, how does race function as a global construct to shape the college experiences of Chinese students in the US? To do so, I examined 15 Chinese students migrating between Shenzhen, a rapidly urbanizing city in China's Pearl River Delta, and Lakeside, a predominantly white university town in the US Midwest. These two sites are uniquely situated within the global student migration, racial relations, and urban transformations. In the late 1970s, China's special economic zone policy made Shenzhen one of the first cities in China to experiment with the market economy. As a result, an emerging urban elite class has benefited significantly from this exception to socialism. In Lakeside, it's a pseudonym that I chose for this university town. It is a medium-sized city in the US Midwest. And it's also ranked one of the most segregated cities in terms of housing and education. In recent decades, constant budget cuts have pushed Lakeside University to seek additional revenues outside the state and federal government. In 2015, the Board of Regents increased the cap of out-of-state students in Lakeside. And as a result, there's a surge of foreign students on campus. In 2019, Chinese students made up 50% of the international student population at Lakeside University, which far exceeded the 34% national average. In this project, I conducted participant observation at multiple spaces in both Shenzhen and Lakeside, such as academic spaces, including classrooms, libraries, study rooms, residential spaces, such as dorms and apartments, and social spaces, such as coffee shops, tea shops, shopping malls, restaurants, etc. I also observed weekly meetings at Chinese student organizations where Shenzhen participants and other Chinese students build close social networks. I've also conducted semi-structured interviews with students, parents, and university employees. The methods also include focus groups and document analysis. The main research findings are as follows. While accelerated transnational mobility enables the creation of neoliberal subjects across borders, it does not necessarily make nation states less relevant. This is manifested in three aspects. First, the international migration of Shenzhen students is connected to the internal migration in China. Before studying abroad, these Chinese students were raised in a family culture immersed in patriotic discourses that attribute their family's wealth to China's opening up policies and centralized governance. Over 200 years ago, the Pearl River Delta was a symbol of China's backwardness and a space of resistance against the imperial government. Since the Reform and Open Up era in the 1970s, however, Pearl River Delta has become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Owing their upward mobility to PRC's policies of state capitalism, many Shenzhen families often echo the broader state rhetoric of the success of the economic reform in China. In Shenzhen, I have always sensed pride and confidence in their conversations about the hometown's prosperity and rapid urbanization. As these families repeatedly told me, we were poor, but we made it. Second, while transnational mobility is what Shenzhen students perceive to be a norm, ultimately they would like to return to China, preferably Shenzhen. All of the student participants were proud of being a Shenzhener, as they believed they were from a city with the best urban infrastructure, superior air quality, and more advanced high-tech industries compared to those in the rest of China. 𝗶혜𝗳, who is expected to take over the family's hotel business, believes that Shenzhen is cosmopolitan, modern, and global, which is the complete opposite of Lakeside. In another case, Ya Chen, who's a Shenzhen girl, plans to launch her career in preschool education in Shenzhen. Her desire to move back to Shenzhen is also due to an inclination to stay technology savvy, which is a crucial part of being cosmopolitan. She would like to be updated on new mobile apps, smart technologies, and artificial intelligence products, which are now booming in China's Pearl River Delta. Another girl, 𝗖cie Wang, her mom also had a shift in expectations since her daughter went to college in the US. When 𝗖cie's mom was preparing 𝗖cie for a private international high school, she was determined to persuade her daughter to permanently stay in the US. At that point, she was also applying for a US green card herself through business investment. However, she changed her mind later. She told me that China is now a lot stronger in economy, and it could be a very good place for young people to work and live. In 2018, the return rate of overseas Chinese was approximately 78%, far higher than the 20% at the beginning of the 2000s. Freedom, mobility, and prestige are no longer considered exclusive to Western societies. Shenzhen, as these students claim, has already become a paradise with economic prosperity, democratic policies, and an advanced education and social welfare system. Third, while living overseas, these Shenzhen students heavily rely on PRC state-affiliated organizations to navigate academic and social contexts. Organizations such as 𝗖liche play a crucial role in Chinese students' social life, filling in a void of social support that institutions oftentimes fail to provide. 𝗖liche also shoulders an important responsibility, that is, to promote patriotic education among overseas Chinese. Pre-departure and post-arrival orientations are part of the crucial works of 𝗖liche. I've attended one of those post-arrival orientations in 2019. I remember sitting in a lecture hall at Lakeside University. The hall was filled with over 200 Chinese students, most of whom had just arrived in the US. Two Chinese consuls attended this orientation. One, a middle-aged female official, began her speech by highlighting the vulnerability of Chinese students in a foreign land. She told the students, "This is a country with loose gun control, frequent burglaries, and ubiquitous violence." A male official later addressed Chinese students' mental challenges in the US, such as loneliness, culture shock, and academic pressure. Students attending this orientation sat still while their eyes welled up with a mixture of uncertainty and fear. Sensing the emotions of this audience, those officials walked toward the edge of the stage and told the students, "Don't forget that you can always rely on your motherland. Your country will always be here whenever you need help." These events are always well received as they address the growing anxiety among parents whose only child are going to live overseas. For students in Lakeside, the first lecture from these organizations teaches them that America is far from the paradise described by the American dream. In addition, Chinese young adults in this study were immersed in pro-PRC ideologies promoted by China-based media. The rise of nationalism in the US since the election of Trump has also been utilized by Chinese media to foster a strong national identity among overseas Chinese. These students have read numerous articles on the inadequacy of Western democracy from Chinese media. For instance, College Daily, with over 1 million active readers per day, often delivers news with Chinese nationalist overtones. It constantly pits the West as China's enemy through a Cold War style of writing, with a language intended to stir strong patriotic sentiments. These are some of the publications that College Daily had delivered in the year of 2019. During the 2019 trade war, for instance, Shenzhen students did not get news updates from US media, but mostly from their Chinese internet blogs. These students feel a responsibility to defend a victimized China against the West. This means that they need to shut off Western media and also to filter information concerning China that's taught in the US classrooms. However, the ethnic enclaves of the Chinese students should not be merely perceived as a result of these students not wanting to integrate into the whole society. Their isolation is also facilitated by the dominance of whiteness ideology in the university town. The ideology of whiteness and culture-based exclusion specifically not only racialize foreign students of color, but also engage with the student population to perpetuate white supremacy. Existing literature shows that foreign students of color are more likely to experience racism than their white international student counterparts. Besides institutional racism, microaggressions and stereotyping are also affecting college experiences of foreign students of color who have a higher risk of depression, acculturated stress, and also victimization. For instance, Chinese international students are often framed in a deficit language in the US classrooms, where they are perceived as passive, unwilling to participate, and uncritical thinkers. In my research, I found that Chinese students were oftentimes objectified as economic capital and diversity signifier. They were frequently excluded in academic, residential, and social spaces. In Lakeside, Chinese students do not always feel welcomed despite the prevalent Midwestern culture of being nice. Jing Lu, a senior student in computer sciences, told me that he had not had much interaction with American students, even if he lived in the US for almost 40 years. Other participants also reported having almost no American friends. In Lakeside, academic spaces sustained by white instructors and white teaching assistants also oftentimes marginalize non-white international students. In residential halls, segregation even begins before the students move in. A coordinator of one of the residential halls told me that domestic students often requested room change when they found that they were assigned an international student roommate. Despite their marginalization, Chinese students in this study believe that it is them rather than the institution or domestic students that shoulder the responsibility to actualize diversity. Han Wu, who's a junior mathematics major, explained to me why campus integration should be the responsibility of international students. She said, because it was us who came to them, not the other way around. We want to know more about them, but they are not interested in knowing more about us. Similarly, Jie Xinzhuo, a junior in psychology department, perceived the segregation of Chinese and domestic students on campus as a natural result of American students not knowing how to approach international students. How do you expect them to approach us if they don't know anything about China? She often told me. When I asked her why she thought Americans would not be willing to learn more, she explained, because there were too many Chinese students. No wonder they lose interest in talking to us. While her comments indicate insufficient institutional support for international students, the way she makes sense of domestic students' indifference to international students also implies the power of whiteness ideology and culture-based racism in consolidating antagonism and maintaining racial inequality. Whiteness ideology, with power and inequity at its core, maintains its dominance through a pliable framework to incorporate all individuals, both privileged and marginalized, to sustain the status quo. Internalizing racial and xenophobic thinking, such as too many Chinese students in the predominantly white universities, these Chinese students passively become part of the whiteness ideology that racializes international students of color, a group in which they are a member. These students' internalization of whiteness ideologies also situated within the global circus of ideology of race. While marginalized by white Americans, Chinese students also voluntarily isolate themselves from Black and Latinx students and communities in Lakeside. Parents also talked about not wanting their children to live in apartments where Black students concentrate, nor to go out at night without company because they think that dangerous Black criminals will impose dangers to Chinese students. There are a few exceptions I observed when Chinese students welcome African Americans into their ethnic enclaves. That is during performing activities such as hip hop and rap. However, the artistic preference of Black culture does not necessarily translate into the appreciation of Blackness. Rather, it echoes colorblindness in new ways that separate Black characteristics in the culture form from their roots in the lives of Black communities. Outside performing hip hop and rap, Chinese students still perceive race as irrelevant to their life, and even voluntarily separate themselves from Black populations. Ziying Wang, for example, claimed that she would never live in the same building with Black people because it was quote-unquote unsafe. To understand these students' attitude towards anti-Blackness, it is important to historicize racial constructs in the context of China. In China, while the term race and racism are rarely used, the conceptual thinking of making difference was formed based on Chinese historical categorizing exercises, as well as China's economic domination by Western imperialism. For example, Han people who ate cooked food, possessed a lighter skin complexion, and conformed to the Confucius moral codes are perceived as superior to other populations who do not follow the same dietary habits, are darker skinned, and do not embrace Han cultures. While Blackness was oftentimes discussed with the slave trade in Americas, Black slave laborers were in fact common in ancient China. As early as Tang Dynasty, Arabian merchants connected the African continent with Asia through the Silk Road, bringing Black slave laborers and selling them to work in royal courts, homes of aristocrats, and affluent urban dwellers. The term Blacks referred to both African and Southeast Asian meaning laborers, and Blackness encapsulated the intersection of a darker skin tone and of free social status. During the 19th century, China's intellectuals began to form new racial understanding that merged historically Chinese differentiating exercises with Western racial ideologies. During the 1950s, China's Cold War geopolitical interests fueled an anti-imperialist agenda to support the independence of African countries and African American struggles. Between 1950 and 1970s, the Chinese government invited African American leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Robert Williams, and Huey Newton to Beijing and treated them with great honor and publicity. Mainstream media in China promoted discourses of Sino-African solidarity and alliance between Chinese revolutionary masses, Black Africans, and diasporic Africans in the US. However, since the open door policies and neoliberal market reforms in the late 1970s, understandings of whiteness, Blackness, and Chineseness reverted back to the predominance of whiteness and anti-African sentiments. Currently, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims at investing in infrastructure, fossil fuels, and agricultural products overseas, further facilitates a new round of colonialism in Africa, as African countries are left in unsustainable levels of debt. As a result, African countries and Blackness, once again, are framed primarily in a deficit language in mainstream discourses. I argue that race functions as a global construct that works hand in hand with the globalization of higher education to shape the experiences of college students. Particularly, it reviews how China's state ideology of Han ethnocentrism works together with whiteness ideology and colorblindness to consolidate differences and cement racial inequity. Overall, my research project reveals that while transnational education is an individual pursuit, the experience of transnational education could be structured by nation states. The seemingly contradictory existence of the transnational desire for Western education and the rising nationalist sentiments, they work jointly in the neoliberal market economy to build entrepreneurial yet patriotic individuals. In predominantly white university town, while Chinese students are largely objectified as capital and excluded on campus, they were also internalizing whiteness ideologies and China's state discourses on anti-Blackness and Han ethnocentrism to validate global racial hierarchy. Ultimately, this project indicates that the movement, mobility, and fluidity endowed by transnationalism could potentially enhance migrant national identity, political intolerance, and racial prejudice. This presentation was mostly based on these two publications that came out in 2020 and 2021. For more information, please feel free to refer to these publications. And if you have further questions, feel free to email me at sjiang33@wisc.edu. Thank you.